You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. Welcome to Jay's Analysis. You're listening to our continued breakdown of Plato's Republic. We've gone through books 1 through 4. We've seen quite a bit of fascinating information. And you can find those lectures at jaysanalysis.com under the podcast and subscription section, where there, if you are a subscriber, you can log in with a password to receive all of the archives and interviews and talks. We're on to book 5 now, and book 5 is fascinating because it's going to be dealing with the topic of communism. Yes, communism in relationship to the ideal republic. Why does Plato teach communism? Well, we're going to see, as well as quite a bit of other fascinating details that will show how far Plato's Republic is actually the background to modern government, modern political theory, and the modern political state. The abolition of family and private property, an idea that goes back at least to Plato, probably prior to that in empires past. But I want to tell you before that, one of Jay's Analysis' sponsors is MichiganMushrooms.net. They have the best organic Michigan mushrooms out of Michigan, I should say, that you can find. And they're great for coffees and teas. They have a variety of assortments there, but for the most part, they specialize in chaga mushrooms, which Solzhenitsyn said was a traditional Russian cure for all kinds of illnesses and immunity boosting. So be sure to check out MichiganMushrooms.net and use the coupon code J, J-A-Y, and you'll get a 10% discount. And tell them that I sent you there, and tell them that you like Jay's Analysis, and tell them that Jay's Analysis is great for promoting Michigan mushrooms, and then they'll love me more, and then you'll love me, and then I'll love you, and we'll be a big happy family. And I apologize for the car going by, but it's too nice of a day today to not have the door open. So let's get into book 5. Remember, MichiganMushrooms.net. And also, if you like this talk, please subscribe to jaysanalysis.com for the full lectures, as this will be a partial lecture for free, and then the full talk will be for subscribers. We're also going to talk about feminism, because Plato's Republic is going to be formative in the history of feminist thought, gender theory, and philosophy, etc. Now, book 5 continues the discussion of virtue and vice that we saw in book 4, but it's immediately interrupted by the character of Polemarchus and other interlocutors, all of whom they want Socrates to explain the remarks that he made in passing about the guardians having basically no possessions, no wives, no children. It's free love, man. You're a soldier, but you're also free love, man. So the guardian class is going to have wives and children in common. And Socrates' lengthy response to their request is the rest of the book, actually. Book 5. And he's going to make a pretty astounding revolutionary proposal that children should actually be brought up by the state. So when you hear MSNBC and Melissa Harris Perry and the Soviets and these different thinkers say that children are not your own, this is not an idea that Karl Marx thought up. It's an idea that goes back to Plato, at least. But Plato doesn't, I don't think, he doesn't seem to think this applies to the entire social order. It's men and women with the same natural ability that should receive the same education and training and do the same kind of work. And thus, we will see, by this logic, Plato thinks there should be female guardians. Women on the front lines, right? Jessica Lynch. The Jessica Lynch scenario, by the way, was directed by Jerry Bruckheimer. That was all created. Now, I mean, this is another area where I'm going to have to disagree with Plato. I don't think we need women on the front lines, and I certainly don't think we need to try to enforce this ideal where there's this class of people that have all things in common. Now, and I also don't think that the state should bring up biological children. That's just insane. What do we see in history where this happens? Well, it doesn't fare well. It tends to not work very well because the problem here is the idea of the individual. And as I've said many times, this can be a dialectic either way. You can have a dialectic of individuals who are anarchic over against any sort of collective identity. And this is what, for example, Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin discusses in his talks, where he talks about how that means then, by logical necessity, that you're not even part of a collective group of, say, females, or you're not a part of a collective of males, right? You're not a part of a collective of humanity. So, right? So the radical, atomistic, individualistic, and Enlightenment perspective of the West, that it's the individual that is the sole proprietor of all things, is itself a dialectical falsity. Now, Western dialectics, as we've said, posits the one against the many, the individual against the collective. And then, of course, the East has always had the tendency towards the collective, the holistic versus the discrete, the particular, the individual. Now, we've said then that the children will be brought up by the city, and Plato thinks that this is the most rational thing for the guardians, who will be the elite warrior class. And many of Socrates or Marx, I think, suggest that the the proposals might apply to everyone, but there's also indications in section 450 that it's just the guardians. So I think that the question is arising, could it apply to everyone? Yes, but is it just the guardians that are going to have women and children as their own? And it must be admitted, at least my editor here in this copy that I have, Grube, says that Plato is not explicit about either position. So he seems to consider both as optional. Now, Glaucon agrees that the city that Socrates describes would be the best one, but he seems to ponder about how it could ever actually happen. How are we ever going to have the ideal city? Now, after some clarifications, Socrates shows that it is possible, he thinks, and that the smallest changes could transform an already existing city into the Callipolis. If kings and rulers become philosophers, of course, and then they could organize the city into the guardians, and under them the proletariat, the proles, the workers. The proposal is likely to produce more outrage than those about women and children, the argument goes. The idea that philosopher kings should rule, Plato thinks, is more controversial than the idea that we can have communism amongst the communalism amongst the guardian class, which is interesting. He thinks, however, that you can enforce this, and then the outrage will subside when the explanation is made clear that true philosophers are not sophists, but they will follow the ideal of reason. Now, Now, why would he think this? Well, he thinks this because he thinks that only the philosophers have the access to reason. And I apologize, but my allergies are going crazy during this season, so I'll try not to sniff and cough as much as I can. So, reason is had purportedly by all humans to some measure, but then it's really the guardians that have a little more reason than the proles, the workers, and then it's the philosopher kings that have a greater access, the closest access to reason than even the guardians, because they're able to tap into the forms. And as we said, the forms are the ideal archetypes, the eternal blueprints and patterns that exist behind the things that we experience in our level of reality. Now this is this city that we're talking about, he thinks is the ideal. It's the form of this city, and everything in reality should be brought into as close a connection to the form of the things as we can make them, at least, right? And you can see why the communist dictators would find this so appealing, because they would be able to say, like Plato says, if the dear leader, the communist dictator, can enforce this, well, eventually everyone will go along. They'll see the light. They'll follow. Even after some period of resistance, the revolution will be bloodless. And the philosopher king, communist leader, will rule. And of course, Marx thought this would lead to the abolition of the state eventually. But Marx's idea was not new. So the abolition of family and private property is what Plato suggests here, right? So as we move into Book 5, the discussion is interesting in that it begins with feminism. And Plato sees this process of installing the ideal republic as one of a refining process. As we've said before, the city's like a man. It has gold, bronze, silver, right? Just like the statue of Daniel's dream in the biblical book of Daniel 4, 2 and 4. And Plato thinks that involuntary manslaughter is not as bad as leading people into lies. So lying about something is actually worse than killing somebody accidentally, because lying shuts out reason, and reason is the highest human faculty, because it touches the realm of the forms. It's what moves people in the direction of absolute truth in the forms. And if there's absolute truth, then it stands to reason, according to Plato, that the state is the incarnation of absolute truth. Now, the reason Plato advocates feminism is that men and women should get the same education, because the human reason, the nous, is something that for Plato is rationality, right? And the psyche, the intellect, is pure rationality, at least in its form, in its particular form in our level of reality. And it's supposed to eventually make its way back to the one, right? So the city is a kind of alchemical process, just like the individual psyche is an alchemical process, and it's a refining fire, like a metallurgist would put metals through. In the same way, the universe, I guess, and societies as a whole go through this process, Plato seems to think. Now, so this is why communism in its history has sought to look back to things like the Republic, as we said in previous lectures. And Plato thinks quite literally that the only difference between men and women is their biology, that women give birth. And that's because mind is more important than body, right? This is the the Greek feature, that even though you would have mimetic art where the body could be displayed as beautiful, it's still really for the Greeks ultimately, even as St. Paul says, Greeks seek wisdom or knowledge, gnosis. And so thus the duality of the body versus the mind or soul is put in tension. This is another form of the dialectic. And this is why Plato would speak of the body as a prison. So he thinks you're going to have elite women guardians, you're going to have elite women soldiers, you're going to have black ops bitches and babes, right? And the lie of the state, the noble lie, Plato sees as a form of drug. It's an opiate. Once again, we can see why the Marxists would get the idea that that religion is the opium of the masses, and so in the Marxist scheme, Marx is claiming to liberate, right, from these older notions of theism and superstition and so forth. Now, is it really liberating? Well, for Marx, I guess Marx thinks so, but is that really the case? Well, and when we move into book 5, section 459, we have an interesting quote. It follows from our previous arguments that the best men must have sex with the best women as frequently as possible, while the opposite is true of the inferior men and women. And second, that if our herd is to be of the highest possible quality, the former offspring must be reared and not the latter. And this must be brought about without being noticed, except by the rulers, so that our herd of guardians remains free from dissension. Interesting. Now, if you know about the SS, the Nazis, they actually kind of tried to have a version of this. I believe it was the Lebensborn program, which was the SS would impregnate the most fit women, purportedly. And note that it's likened to breeding. So here we have the science, supposedly, of breeding and the choice of the fittest and so forth. Now, but of course, the fittest is going to be not necessarily what you or I think the fittest is. It's going to be the state, the rulers that determine who the fittest are and what qualifications and what criterion make up the so-called fittest. And isn't it funny that that this is really elaborate, right? It's a conspiratorial state, actually, because it goes on to say, after this eugenics idea here, as well as dysgenics, both in this section, it goes on to say that, well, what we'll do is we'll have certain festivals and sacrifices and feasts. We'll establish them by law at certain times. We'll bring out brides and grooms, and it's all the people that we've chosen, and we'll direct the poets to compose the appropriate hymns for the marriages that will take place. In other words, we'll secretly arrange them, and we'll let the people think that they're falling in love. We'll leave the number of the marriages for the rulers to decide, but their aim will be to keep the number of males as stable as they can, taking into account war, disease, and similar factors, so that the city, as far as is possible, will not become too big or small. Population control. We'll have some sophisticated lotteries so that each marriage of the inferior people we mentioned will blame luck rather than the rulers when they aren't chosen. But the choosing of the elite will be actually certain. The lotto process will be rigged. And among other prizes and rewards, the young men who are good in war, we'll give them permission to have sex with all the babes more often. That's what it says. This will be a good pretext for having them father as many children as possible. Then, as children are born, we'll take them over by the officials appointed for the purpose, who may either be men or women, since both offices are open to both sexes. Any children that are born with defects, they will, or to inferior parents,
We will hide them in a secret unknown place, as is appropriate. It is, if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure. There can be no doubt, the note says, Plato recommends infanticide. By exposure, you just throw the babies out with the bathwater, quite literally. A practice that was common in Greece as a form of birth control. Wow. I mean, this is pretty intense here, right? I mean, it's elaborate. This is the conspiracy state that's going so far as to determine precisely who will marry who through arranged lotteries and arranged dances, and all the while the people will think that they're falling in love. Wow. I mean, it's just crazy. Did you know this? Did you know that Plato taught this? It's very much an elitist view, for sure. There's no question there. That doesn't mean, however, that I think that there's nothing true about breeding. But the problem is that humans are not just beasts. They are made in the image of God, I believe. So, Plato, however, thinks that the state is one big gigantic body, big organism, and that you as an individual are merely a cell in the organism of the body of the state. You're an organism of the state. This is quite contrary to the model, actually, that Paul presents in 1 Corinthians 12 of the church as the body. Right, this is the church. Would be quite a challenge to this as it came to exist in the Roman Empire, to this older view that the Roman Empire would adopt of the empire as the body of the God-man Caesar. Now, it's interesting too that the Athenian democracy had 9 archontes, or archons, or rulers, and these included chief magistrates, chief military leader, authorities in religious matters, and so forth. And Plato says that these archons in the democracy are rulers or despots. And democracy just ain't no good, baby. It sucks. It just leads to chaos and revolution and oligarchy. And that actually is true. That's what happens in history with so-called democracy. Now, Plato sees different natures in men. He says some have silly adolescent ideas of happiness. Some of them are more like dogs. And much of it is like the tending of animals. So viewing the polis, the herd, as just basically a bunch of animals that have to be culled, they have to be controlled through war, population-wise, they have to be indoctrinated with the noble lie. And he says that famous warriors, we will make them into gods, right? We'll create myths about the warriors and turn them into gods, and this will give people heroes for the Greek race, he says. And, you know, again, it's Plato sees the mass as a bunch of animals, a herd of dogs. I don't know if the dogs come in a pack of dogs, a herd of cattle that have to be tended, they have to graze, they have to be coddled, and you have to give them, you know, love and affection, which Daddy State will do through the religious mythology that will be created. Sometimes there may be wars and civil wars, and this will have to be dealt with. But nevertheless, the philosopher kings will run your lives well. just trust Plato. And Plato thinks that until philosophy rules, we will never have the philosopher king. And for him, I'll read what he says here in section 473. Until philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures of those who at present pursue either one exclusively or forcibly prevented from doing so, then the cities will have no rest from evil, nor will the human race. So, until you make me world emperor, we won't have world peace. It's quite a sales pitch, isn't it? That's the ultimate philosopher's sales pitch. Oh well, Socrates said that until you make me the philosopher king, you're not gonna have world peace. But trust me, I can bring it, baby. Trust me. Well, and why does he think that? Well, because he thinks that philosophers really are the only ones that love what's true. Workers are worried about working and making a wage in their craft. Guardians are worried about the virtues of warfare and courage and fighting. And they don't have time for, sitting around and tapping and touching into that realm of forms. They got other stuff to do. The philosopher, Plato thinks, has seen the good itself. That is, he's looked towards the one, tapped into the realm of the forms, which is the one, the monad, the source of all everything ultimately, but the source of all truth particularly. And because truth in terms of the one is not multifold, manifold, or many, but unitive and singular, and for Plato that's a higher form of things ontologically, then because of that, the philosopher's in a better position. Whereas everyone else, they've only seen reflections in pieces of the good. So the guardian who's understood justice, who's understood courage, bravery, patriotism, those are just little pieces and sections of the good. The philosopher has stared into the good and sees it in unity. He doesn't just see pieces, he sees them all. He sees beauty itself. He sees justice itself. He sees the universals of things. The note here, Socrates is referring either to particular things that are beautiful or to the beauties in them, which are the properties or universals. And that's what's interesting here, is that you're seeing the metaphysical unity behind things in Plato's mind as a philosopher. A poem is fashioned out of sounds and painting out of color and shape, but together all of the letters and sounds combine to be a complete poem. You're listening to Jay's analysis as I deconstruct Plato's Republic, Book 5. This is the first half of a free talk. The full talk can be obtained by subscribing to jaysanalysis.com at the PayPal link, and I will email you within a day or two the password to subscribe and log in. Thank you for listening, and if you like philosophy, if you like these talks, tell your friends and help me out, because we really need to spread critical thinking. We need to spread rationality, not be led about by statist education. Thank you.